couple of years ago, I stumbled across an essay by C.S. Lewis titled On the Reading of Old Books. And in this essay, he makes an argument for the importance of reading classic books from previous eras. And as I was reading it, I realized that the points he makes are just as relevant to worship music. So today, I want to apply Lewis's argument about books to music and show how listening to old worship songs, not just the newest and latest ones, can help you become more discerning. First, let's consider what Lewis said about old books versus modern books in his own words. I'm going to read an excerpt from his essay, which comes from the introduction he provided for a translation of Athanasius's masterful theological work on the Incarnation. Here's what Lewis said. Every age has its own outlook, especially good at seeing certain truths, especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all therefore need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period, and that means the old books. All contemporary writers share to some extent the contemporary outlook, even those like myself who seem most opposed to it. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming, without question, a good deal with which we should now absolutely deny, though they thought they were as completely opposed as two sides can be, but in fact they were all the time secretly united with each other and against earlier and later ages by a great mass of common assumptions. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing, and their own errors, being now open and palpable, will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately, we cannot get at them. So just to pull out a few of the key points he made there and summarize them, what Lewis said is all people have blind spots, and people who live in the same time period and the same culture will tend to share common assumptions. And so if we only read modern books, then those books will affirm the mistaken beliefs of our time. They generally won't challenge them. So the solution, according to Lewis, is to read old books, or as he said so beautifully, quote, to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, unquote. And Lewis also pointed out that reading new books is not a bad thing. He himself was an author of books that at the time he wrote were contemporary books, of course. But what he was saying is that we should also read books that have stood the test of time, because books that have stood that test of time will have had their hidden implications exposed through the course of time. And those may be hidden implications that even the author himself or herself was unaware of. So reading old books provides perspective on what he referred to as the controversies of the moment. And I might add that reading old books, providing perspective on the controversies of the moment, will help protect us against getting drawn into the latest heresy or aberrant movement or theological fad. Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Lewis. If we as believers only read a diet of exclusively modern books, then it's going to be deficient. I like to think of the analogy of traveling. If any of you have ever had the opportunity before to travel outside of your own country, go to new places, meet people from different cultures, then you've likely had the experience of gaining new eyes and a fresh perspective to help you appreciate your own culture more. You probably notice weaknesses you didn't really notice before, And you probably also appreciated the strengths of your culture more. And that was because you now had perspective of having traveled to another place to, by comparison, note the differences in the cultures. Well, I think the same can be said about reading old books. But couldn't the same also be said about songs? If we listen to the music, the songs of previous generations, then we would likely notice marked differences in the theology and the themes and the emphases of those songs. We would probably pick up more on the predispositions of our own era, and our personal theology and our assumptions may even be challenged in the process, and that's a good thing. So just think for a moment about the songs that your church sings or that you hear on Christian radio or hear streaming online. What are the lyrics most frequently about? What are the theological assumptions? What are the buzzwords, those words and phrases that you hear popping up over and over again? And how would that compare to songs written by earlier generations of Christians? I came across a fascinating news story earlier this month that actually provides some interesting background or insight into these questions I wanted to share with you. About a century ago, some archaeologists who were in Egypt uncovered a fragment of a papyrus that contains the oldest surviving hymn with musical notation. So there are other hymns, surviving hymns, but this is the oldest surviving hymn with musical notation. It's about 1,800 years old. And so this hymn was written by Christians at the time that they were facing persecution in Rome, in the Roman Empire. And so this fragment was just tucked away into this temperature-controlled vault. And more recently, a Bible scholar named John Dickson decided that he wanted to bring this hymn back to life. The thing is, the melody would be very difficult to sing in a modern church setting, so he commissioned some modern worship leaders, Chris Tomlin and Ben Fielding, to update the melody and to help come up with some new words, because some of the words in the fragment were missing. So they were looking for words that they thought would be true to the original, and to just bring the song back to life for churches. They made a documentary about it. You can actually listen to this documentary or watch this documentary and actually listen to John Dickson sing some of the song in the original melody and language. And the two things that were really fascinating to me, though, about this hymn, first of all, it showed us what some of the focus of the early Christians was. And in the case of this hymn, it's actually a hymn to the Trinity. So that showed us some of their emphasis. And what's really interesting about this particular emphasis is that this hymn was written in the century before the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was in 325 AD, and some skeptics of Christianity would try to say that the doctrine of the Trinity was actually invented at the Council of Nicaea, and that's actually completely untrue. But what this hymn shows is that Christians were singing a hymn to the Trinity in the century before the Council of Nicaea. So I thought that was pretty interesting to read about how that ancient song is being resurrected. Yet today's churches use mostly recent songs. And by recent, I mean very recent, like in the last decade. So much so that this has become something that the Babylon Bee, that Christian satire site, frequently pokes fun at. They've had headlines, for example, worship leaders stunned to learn there are worship songs written before 2016. Or this headline, finally, they're playing an old hymn in church. Wait, false alarm, they've added a weird new chorus. And while these headlines and articles are satire and they're intended to get a chuckle out of readers, they also tap into a complaint that I've heard from many readers of the books that Doug Guyvett and I have written about the New Apostolic Reformation movement. And this is the complaint that their church only sings songs from Bethel or Elevation or Hillsong or other fill-in-the-blank popular music group today, and that their church rarely sings the great old hymns. And it's not just that most songs are recent. They're also written by a very small cadre of songwriters affiliated with just a few mega churches. This was reported by the Religion News Service in April 2023 in an article titled, "There's a Reason Every Hit Worship Song Sounds the Same." The fact that a select few songwriters and few music industry executives choose the majority of the music that's sung in today's churches reminds me of a scene in the movie The Devil Wears Prada. In the scene, Miranda, who's a fashion industry leader, is educating her young assistant, Andy, about the fashion business. Now, Andy is someone who just really isn't interested in fashion. She really prides herself on the fact that she could care least about fashion, which is ironic because she's working in the fashion industry. And so her boss chides her for her naivety and begins to snarkily explain to her how fashion works and how Andy is not untouched or above the fashion industry like she thinks she is. And so Miranda explains that there's some fashion insider somewhere who selects what the next in color is going to be for the season. And then the next thing you know, that the other collection designers are carrying that color in their collections. And then it's showing up in the department stores. And then it trickles down to the casual stores. And then Miranda tells Andy, "You're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room." It's one thing to find out that your clothing choices are more influenced than you may have realized by New York fashion designers. But it's another thing to know that the songs your church sings on Sunday morning have largely been determined by an elite few of worship music power brokers. Why is this a concern as it relates to worship music? Well, it goes back to what C.S. Lewis was talking about, that if you only read modern books, then you're only reading books by people who share the same assumptions, and those assumptions may be mistaken. And so if all of our worship music today is being produced by the same few people, then those people will likely share many assumptions, and some of those assumptions could be mistaken. But if we don't listen to music written by people outside of that select group, then we won't be able to have the perspective to have our blinders removed so we can see maybe what some of those errors might be. And the issue becomes all the more serious when many of those same people who write the songs are influenced by unbiblical, aberrant NAR theology. And the leaders of some of these churches, like at Bethel Church in Redding, California, the most well-known NAR church today, have explicitly stated that they see their music as a tool for spreading their teachings and practices to churches. And so that just makes the issue all the more serious when such a few number of people are actually writing our songs today. I should add that it's nothing new that music would be used to spread aberrant and heretical teachings. The 4th century heretic Arius sought to spread his anti-Trinitarian theology to lay people by putting his heretical theology to catchy worship tunes. In short, most of the worship songs we sing today are recent. They're produced by a few churches. And what's more, I haven't even talked about this yet, they're almost exclusively from Western nations. How might the emphases and assumptions differ if worship music included songs from developing countries where poverty and persecution are extreme? I ran across this article from Open Doors for May 2024 about persecuted Christians in Manipur State, India. And it's about how Christians there have adopted the song, "I Have Decided to Follow Jesus," that classic 20th century hymn. They've adopted it as a sort of anthem in the midst of the persecution, severe persecution they've been facing there. This one group of Christians, it talks about they had their church burned down, and so they're meeting in a home while someone stands watch at the door during their service. And according to many sources, this song, which was actually popularized during the Billy Graham Crusades, it actually was written in a much different context in India and in the midst of persecution. And the words, "I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. And if no one joins me, still I will follow. And the cross before me, the world behind me," are about dedication to Jesus despite opposition. And they're all the more powerful against the backdrop of persecution that believers in India and many parts of the world are experiencing today. So how much so could music that is sung in these countries that are facing such hardship, but believers are facing such hardship, provide a corrective to so much of the music in the West that is colored by NAR and prosperity gospel teachings? Of course, people living outside the West can have poor theology too, but it should be obvious how having the clean sea breeze of music from a wider variety of geographies and generations blowing through our minds can help clear away the idiosyncrasies and novelties and aberrations of our own age. So now I want to give you 3 suggestions as takeaway from this episode. First, I want to give you advice from C.S. Lewis himself in his essay. He said, "It's a good rule after reading a new book never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones." That's good advice, and it can also be applied to songs. You may not be able to control what your church sings, but you can control what you listen to on your own time and what you intentionally expose your children to. So for every modern worship song that you listen to or album you listen to, consider listening to a hymn or an album, of hymns. Avoid fixation on what's new and what's next, and consider what came before. C.S. Lewis noted that he had trouble convincing his students to read the old writers, the ancient writers, and he talked about how he would try to persuade his students that actually when they read the old writers, they would find them more accessible and more delightful than they had anticipated. Now, some people dislike hymns. They feel like they're outdated and they just don't enjoy them. They prefer the modern music. And that part of that's just musical taste. People will have their preferences, and some people can develop a taste for older music through exposure. Some people may never really come to love the older music, but even so, the value that comes from listening to old music in addition to new music still remains. And one thing I would point out is those who have a particularly strong aversion to hymns sometimes and the old music, it might be because they really are looking for experience and feeling passion as they sing. And so it's important to keep in mind that we need to make sure that we are focused more on truth, and that the feelings and emotions follow from that, and that we're not making an idol of how we feel or what we experience while singing worship songs. Heartfelt worship is good, but Jesus said God is to be worshiped, quote, in spirit and truth, unquote. That comes from John 4:23-24. And Lewis noted that he often would experience greater devotion when reading doctrinal books than he would when he read so-called devotional books. And that's likely because those doctrinal books were firmly anchored in truth. And I've talked to others who've had this experience. I've had this experience myself, where sometimes the times of where I experience greatest devotion is when I'm reading books of theology. So I encourage you, if you're not in the practice of reading rich theological works, to add that to your life and see how that may impact your devotional life, and that it's about much more than just gaining head knowledge, but reading these great works of truth will actually help you grow in your walk and your relationship experientially with God as well. Similarly, many people have talked about how when they sing hymns, they actually experience great devotion because of the rich theological truths that so many of the hymns are laden with. But it's important to realize that just because a song is older doesn't necessarily mean it's theologically sound. There's a fallacy known as appeal to antiquity, or maybe sometimes also called appeal to tradition. And that's the idea that something that's older is automatically better or it's automatically truer. And conversely, there's another fallacy known as appeal to novelty. And that's really the opposite, that when something is newer, it's automatically better. And these fallacies are often employed in advertising. You may notice that as you think of these fallacies and are watching ads. And they can also be used, unfortunately, at times in the church. So beware of those fallacies. Hymns can have poor theology, and some modern songs have great theology. But Lewis himself even made the point that the old books had mistakes too, but not the same mistakes. So the old books won't reinforce our mistaken beliefs, and the mistakes they do make will be obvious to us. So that it can be true of songs as well, that the older songs that make mistakes will be more obvious to us. But listening to the older songs in contrast to the newer songs can also help us see where maybe our assumptions have been mistaken. The important thing isn't that a song is new or old, it's that it contains truth. And even then, just because a song does contain truth doesn't necessarily mean that a church should use that song. There are other factors to take into account, such as the source of a song and whether a church wants to point people to that source. So there's more to think about when deciding which songs a church will use than just if those songs contain truth. And that's why it's not just enough to screen the lyrics of songs for soundness. There are other factors to also take into consideration. Second, when you listen to modern music or old music, any music, pay close attention to the lyrics and evaluate them by scripture and careful reasoning. Do this during your next church service. What are the theological assumptions? What do the lyrics emphasize? And are those same things emphasized by scripture? What expectations do they create in those who listen to them? And when you do this, also pay attention to a song's credits. Many churches will display them on the slide with the lyrics, or they'll put them in their church bulletin. Take mental note of the names and the credits so you develop an understanding of the worship music landscape, who's writing and producing the songs. And if you do this and look up the churches where the music writers come from, you'll see the same names and again, but you'll also begin to get an idea of who's producing the sound music and what music to steer clear of. Third, consider expanding the selection in your playlist so it doesn't include just the same swath of songwriters and music, but also include music from other lesser known groups or even groups and singers from other countries. And now I'm speaking to worship leaders. In addition to adding more hymns to your rotation on Sunday mornings, consider also adding modern songs to the rotation that don't fit the same mold. So by doing these three things, by singing old songs, by evaluating all songs by scripture and careful reasoning, and by mixing up your music and adding modern songs from a wider range of sources, you're going to be in a better position to detect and correct your theological blind spots. So that's it for now. If you're interested in learning more about the dangers specifically of NAR music, earlier in this episode, I referenced that Bethel leaders have explicitly stated that they see their music as a tool for spreading their teachings to churches. If you'd like to see that and the documentation for that, then check out my co-authored book, Counterfeit Kingdom, where we have an entire chapter about this music titled Toxic Worship Music. See you next time.